All right, everyone, we're going to get started. Thank you so much again for joining our webinar today. I'm really excited to have Katie Valenzuela Garcia and Jonathan London on the line. Katie here in person with some of our Sacramento fellows at the LGC office, which is exciting. So they're both going to give a lot more of an overview of both their work and the presentation, but do want to give them both short introductions as well. But before I do that, a couple of logistics. Definitely want to encourage people to use the question bar throughout. Definitely send me your questions, and I'll pass them along to Katie and Jonathan. We'll have a good amount of time at the end of our presentation for Q&A, but definitely encourage you to send those questions throughout. And if at any time you lose audio or lose the visuals, please let me know. We've been having some slight Wi-Fi issues, so want to make sure that we're catching that as soon as possible. So now to get started, I'm going to give both Katie and Jonathan quick introductions, and then I'll pass it over to Katie first. So first of all, Katie Valenzuela Garcia has over 16 years of community development experience and is passionate about helping neighborhood leaders be active participants in decision making. In 2015, she founded Valenzuela Garcia Consulting to better partner with advocates and community groups to advance systems change. Katie holds a bachelor's and a master's degree in community development from UC Davis and is a leadership fellow with the Sierra Health Foundation. So really excited to have her with us today. And we're also joined by Jonathan London, who's the director of the Center for Regional Change and an associate professor in the Department of Human and Community Development at UC Davis. Jonathan conducts research on conflicts and collaboration in natural resource and environmental justice issues, specifically on marginalized rural communities and environmental justice in the Sierra Nevada and Central Valley regions. He holds a master's of city and regional planning and a PhD in environmental science, policy, and management from UC Berkeley. So thank you both so much for joining us today. Really excited to have you on this webinar. And now I'll pass it over to Katie.
Great, thank you. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I'm really excited to be with you all for the second year in a row. It's a pleasure to be welcomed here. So I'm going to start us off, and then I'm going to push it over to Jonathan and round us out. We want to leave plenty of time for your questions and discussions, since this is probably a fairly new topic for some of you, and we want to make sure that we have lots of time to interact and answer any questions after we get started. No. Oh, got it. It's okay. So this is the definition of environmental justice that we use as sort of the foundation of our work. But really, to summarize, environmental justice is a people's movement, really confronting systemic racism as it materializes in land use policy, as well as resources and investments. The picture on the top of the screen is actually used to be the house next door to me in Oak Park, and the one below that is a house just another half mile north of where we live. So we're going to talk a lot today about the disparities that we see in health outcomes as a result of the built environment, as well as exposure to sources of pollution, and the ability of communities to have the social capital to confront those issues when they arise. No, I keep doing the wrong one. Dang it. Nope. Aha. Okay, so a little bit about me. I will promise I'll figure out how to click through these slides in more speedy order. So I grew up in Oildale, which is an unincorporated town on the north side of Bakersfield in Kern County. I left Oildale to go study at UC Davis, where I was lucky enough to work for Jonathan at the Center for Regional Change when he was getting started. I've since spent my career really staffing these statewide and local coalitions, first at Public Advocates, which is a civil rights law firm that was staffing a coalition of parent and students who were trying to inform education policy at the state level. Then at the local level with the Coalition on Regional Equity that was housed at the Sacramento Housing Alliance. I am currently, well, as of last Wednesday, the president of the Oak Park Neighborhood Association, but I also sit on the South Oak Park Community Association Board of Directors. There's a distinction there in that part of our neighborhood is still unincorporated, which is another one of those racialized land use issues that it's right next to the built city, but not incorporated, so we have our own association for that area. And at the state level, I sit on the AB 32 Environmental Justice Advisory Committee that's currently informing the scoping plan to reach our 2030 targets as a state, as well as the Office of Health Equities Advisory committee. So I am pretty well split between things I'm paid to do in my consultancy role, which is working for nonprofits and advocates, and things that I'm doing just in my own time as a resident and activist here in Sacramento. So to give you a little bit of a framework for what we're doing in Sacramento, Sacramento is different than a lot of other environmental justice regions across the state, primarily because we haven't spent the time building capacity in communities to organize and engage in policy decisions. So because we're the capital city, a lot of focus on state policy and being elected into office and working for different Capitol building offices and organizations. There's been a void in groups at the local level, really organizing and helping people identify and confront some of the issues that Jonathan will get into in the rest of his presentation. So what I've been working on in my unpaid role is trying to figure out, so one thing we do have in all neighborhoods in Sacramento are neighborhood associations. They're sort of a tricky beast to work with because neighborhood associations historically were formed around police activity and protecting property values. And so they've historically been a place that have oppressed sometimes the ability for folks to integrate into more affluent communities, as well as places where policing were seen as a predominant intervention rather than community buildings. But here in Sacramento, in each of our environmental justice communities, we have some form of neighborhood association of at least 5 to sometimes 20 individuals that are coming together monthly trying to improve their community for the better. So I've been working with those folks as well as other more informal community groups, advocacy groups, and just individual leaders under the umbrella of the Sacramento Neighborhood Coalition, where we're really taking it back to basics here. What we have in rural parts of the Central Valley, where you've had farm worker organizing in LA and the Bay Area, is this decades of organizing and capacity building that have happened to help build the strength of those regions to advocate for environmental justice challenges. So to build that here, we're starting with the Neighborhood Coalition to just build that initial capacity. Like a lot of folks don't know how to canvass, don't know how to survey themselves, don't really understand how change happens, what it means when you see something happen in your neighborhood that's also happening in another neighborhood, and how to identify where that comes from and what you need to do to confront that in a policy manner. So working in that level, but also trying to be a little proactive and actually work on issues that impact all of us. One thing that we see in environmental justice communities, for instance, is that there are no banks. That if there are banks, just as recently as a few months ago, we lost one of our banks in Oak Park. Bank of America, in fact, has closed 8 branches in Sacramento in the last 2 years, and 6 of them have been in low moderate income census tracts that would be identified as EJ communities. And so what does it mean when you can't access capital to either own your home or start your own business? What does it mean for your children if they can't open a bank account and learn how to manage money with the help of banking professionals? So community banking is one of our main priorities. Also, community land trust. With the loss of redevelopment at the state level, there is nobody who's doing community development just for the community. There's some nonprofit developers that are doing affordable development, but we're trying to build an actual new 501c3 that's governed by residents that will dictate development on land that land trust owns and stewards forever. It gives us the ability to set what the price will be on your house if you were to buy a house from us and resell it, so we can keep neighborhoods affordable as we start seeing gentrification spread more from downtown Sacramento into neighborhoods like Oak Park. But it also gives community members that skill to work together and with development professionals and local government officials to address those systemic land use challenges in really strategic long-term ways. Also, a priority of ours around safety, thinking traditionally, not just in terms of working with police better, but also what are those alternatives to policing? You know, if somebody comes, as somebody did just a few months ago, and my husband's gone and he decides to camp out on my front porch. I try calling my neighbors. Nobody's home, of course, because nobody's home when you need them to be home, to come by and ask the gentleman to move along. I can't open my front door because he's leaning against my front door. What are my options? My only option right now is to call the police. And what would be great is if there was somebody I could call who maybe just worked with homeless individuals who could come and talk to that person. If there's somebody having a mental health issue in our park, like there was a gentleman running around with a knife one day, like can I call someone who's a mental health specialist who can work with that person who's clearly just having a mental health issue but isn't necessarily posing a danger to the people around him? So how do we find those alternatives to the policing? And this is something that we're trying to work really closely with our local Black Lives Matter chapter on, staffing those alternatives as well as giving community members tools to actually help themselves work with their neighbors to achieve better safety rather than relying on police who are really not trained for that. And then finally, youth pathways. Something in Sacramento, we have an open enrollment district, which means that kids are moving all over the city to better performing schools. So what you're seeing are neighborhood schools in these AJ communities are losing kids, they're hemorrhaging kids, and their academic performance is really low to the schools in more affluent communities that historically have more resources because we fund it through property taxes that are performing better. And you're starting to see this really great divide between the kids who have what they need to be equipped to go on to college or careers and the kids who do not. So we're working just really simply trying to think about simple community interventions to help place youth with mentors, to help place them with paid internship at local businesses so we can also foster business development. But in general, one of the things that we know is that kids in our neighborhoods suffer from adverse childhood experiences at a higher rate than kids in other neighborhoods, and that's contributing to their inability to complete school successfully. So how do we as a community bound around these kids and make sure that they have what they need to feel supported and graduate successfully? So hopefully what you see in our policy platform here is, I mean, we're not necessarily working on toxics, we're not necessarily working on like air quality issues, but we're being upstream with some of the issues that perpetuate the outcomes that we're seeing in our neighborhoods, and through the process trying to build capacity and power to engage in other issues as well. So with that, a little context in the local issue, I will pass it over to Jonathan.
Great. So, Kristen, are you going to go to sharing my screen?
Yeah, I can definitely do that. Let me pass it over to you.
Okay. And all right. So can you see this slide, Jonathan London, EJ autobiography?
It hasn't popped up quite yet.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Oops. Oh, how about that?
There you go. Perfect.
Okay. All right. Good. I just had a find button. Okay. Very good. So, so as I often do after Katie goes, I realize that I probably could have just stayed home because she covered this brilliantly. So I'm going to perhaps create a little context, kind of conceptually and data-wise for the really important work that Katie just described. So just really briefly about me, and as Kristen said, I've always been in interdisciplinary programs and also with a real focus on application, and that really informs what I do now at the university and the work that I'll show you. After I finished my PhD, I co-directed a nonprofit I had co-founded like 15 years before, right after I finished college, along with my wife and another friend, called Youth in Focus, and we trained young people to do community action research on issues of concern to them, including environmental justice, but a lot of the upstream issues, as Katie said, as well. So I brought that kind of nonprofit academic training into my work. All the work that I do, and I'll share with you this major example, has this collaborative and participatory action research approach where, as a researcher, I'm coming in as a partner and very much as a learner, as much as I am a teacher, and really understanding principles of environmental justice being about community speaking for themselves, and in this case, researchers providing information that can help inform the ways that communities are representing and acting on their behalf, as well as working with public agencies and other entities to help them understand in the language that they can understand, the data language, what's going on in these communities. And then the center that I run, the Center for Regional Change, is a home for these kinds of action research. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so environmental justice has a number of different components to it. As Katie said, it is a movement, and one key part of that movement is that it looks at the issue of distribution. So who and what communities are being affected disproportionately by hazards, and what are the communities that are not getting access to the kinds of resources that they need to be healthy. As I mentioned, it's also about speaking for ourselves and about genuine participation. This is Sheila Arnstein's ladder of participation from the lowest levels of non-participation, manipulation there, all the way up to control. And these days, it's very important to emphasize when we say citizen, we mean cultural citizens. So all people who have a stake in a given society consider citizens, not just those who have certain kinds of papers. It's also about respect. This is probably increasingly getting old school, but I can't help it talking about Aretha Franklin. And so it's not just are people being listened to, or are they given the chance to speak at a public hearing or send in testimony, but that the knowledge that they have based on their lived life experiences are afforded the same kinds of respect as you would scientists bringing in other kinds of data. And then finally, there's this idea of thriving. So again, it's not just enough to say have resources, to be able to participate, have your knowledge accepted as valid, but also to really ultimately have a thriving, healthy, equitable community and region and world. That's really where the movement is going. So one project that helped to forward those notions and values of environmental justice is the one that ended up producing this report, Capitalizing Environmental Justice in the Sacramento Region. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the process and a fair bit about the data in the report. So why did we do this report in the first place? So we did partly because, unlike a lot of other regions of the state that had their own environmental justice reports, including a couple that we did in the San Joaquin Valley and down in the Coachella Valley, Sacramento region hasn't, until last year, or I guess now a year and a half ago, had their own report. And Katie described it really insightfully about the challenges that environmental justice movements have in the Sacramento region, because it's a capital city, so a lot of the eyes are trained on the Capitol, and a lot of the activists here who are, world-class activists are doing, in many cases, statewide work, and there's less resources happening locally. There's a lot of other factors as well, which we can get into, but it was important to help the region and the activists in the region tell their story. So the Center for Regional Change worked with a wide variety of community partners for the initial phases. That was centered around this Coalition on Regional Equity that has now ceased to exist, but for a number of years was really a pivot point for environmental justice, health, civil rights, homelessness, affordable housing, labor, and other organizations working on this vision of a region in which all people and all communities had what they needed to thrive. Those community partners individually included SAC Housing Alliance, Ubuntu Green, Environmental Justice Coalition for Water, and others. And that work has continued, and the report continued even after CORE closed, and worked with the individual organizations, and the center continues to work with these two. Ubuntu Green itself has closed its doors in the near term, or in recently. Okay, so that's sort of the who and the why. So let's go to the where and what. So one thing that is really important and is often not done in environmental justice analysis is putting it into a historical context. And so very often what that means is that communities, including the ones you're from, have very long memories, and just looking at like the particular issue at the particular time, the particular place, often really misses this deeper history. So we started the project really trying to understand and put into context the current day project. So we've got to go back to the initial interactions of European settlers before it was the United States. It was Mexico, and before that, and the Spanish Crown, and really the genocidal relationships with Native American populations that reverberate to this day. Native American communities are, of course, still here and also still bear the marks of truly genocidal relationships with Europeans. We also really need to understand about slavery, and even though California formally wasn't a slave state, it was very much marked by the dynamics of slavery, by anti-Chinese exclusion and violence. The Chinatown in Sacramento burned several times, often with the fire department standing by, and some had claimed actually having lit the fires. Also, the Japanese internment in the 1940s, and you can still again see the impacts of neighborhoods that had been destroyed, first knocked down in the what's the Capitol Mall area, and then as communities settled a little bit further out from there in the 20s and 30s, then interned and a whole way of life destroyed. And many of the Japanese were actually involved in agriculture, which plays into the San Joaquin Valley story, which we won't get into today. And then urban redevelopment and really the destruction of thriving, multi-ethnic, multi-income communities. This was a picture in what's called the Old West Side, and now is the fabricated neighborhood of Old Sacramento, which is, it's not old at all. It stands on the ruins of what truly was Old Sacramento. So that's sort of the deeper past. So then there's a wide variety of historical legacies closer in. So the Aerojet plant in just to the east of Sacramento was a place that was really core to the development of the whole military-industrial complex from the 20s on, and those rockets, of course, were powered by rocket fuel, and that leaked, and you see these sort of colored blobs. Those are plumes of toxics, including perchlorate and rocket fuel that literally was up into people's drinking water and continues to threaten the whole American River corridor, and therefore all various communities that depend on those important drinking water supplies. So with that, that kind of broader background up until the 90s, then in the 2000s, as I mentioned, the Coalition on Regional Equity developed a number of different strategies and sort of organizations like Ubuntu Green picked this up and developed Sacramento Environmental Justice Working Group, and they developed, and Katie was core to that, so to speak, was central to that, a definition of environmental justice. I won't read all of that here, but you could see a really holistic view, not just about toxics, but about healthy and sustainable, safe and thriving neighborhoods, collaborative, working across public and private, focusing on the most vulnerable communities and getting involved and supporting them for permanent solutions, and really thinking about making sure that those efforts are all inclusive. So it was based on those values and trying to address these historical legacies and more recent environmental inequities that this report came out of. So I'll now show some of the data that we use to try to inform these environmental justice strategies. So we used a tool that's called California EnviroScreen, or CalEnviroScreen. It's now been updated to 3.0, but basically is a way of creating holistic or cumulative measures of both environmental burden, including things like pesticides and air quality and water quality and toxic release facilities and solid waste facilities, as well as a social vulnerability or a sort of a sensitive population measure about racial or concentrated, segregated racial patterns, concentrated poverty, issues of education, unemployment, linguistic fluency, housing poverty, and other factors. So we used that and then created a version of it that was relevant for the 6-county Sacramento area, from Yolo County here in the west to essentially the Tahoe border in the east up into Yuba. And now this is very much under under threat from Oroville Dam failure, potential failure, all the way down to the Delta. So we looked at a variety of issues, and a lot of times environmental justice focuses in urban areas, and often when we think about the Sacramento region, we think about the urban core, and we thought about it as well, but we really wanted to also emphasize the rural edges and injustices at the rural edges, but also the real innovations there. So looking at new housing for farm workers, the conditions under which farm workers are often living, often with significant exposures to pesticide. This actually is a picture at Full Belly Farm in the Capay Valley up in the northwest of Yolo County that has really, it's an organic farm, permaculture, very progressive labor practices. Native American stewardship. This is the chairman of the Yochidiki Wintu Nation, Marshall McKay, who's doing, and his tribe and community doing amazing stewardship work, and then things like the RUCs from the Sacramento Area Council of Governments doing kind of rural sustainability. We also looked at food justice, and Katie talked a little bit about this, but the Sacramento Urban Ag Coalition that just, I think a couple weeks ago, Katie, was victorious in getting the County of Sacramento to pass an ag ordinance that allows individuals as well as community groups to process and sell produce from their home gardens, and kind of open up both a kind of a new agricultural landscape and a whole community economic development strategy. This is Kanok Yisrael from Israel Family Farms, working with a wide variety of community members, and that's like I think just a really vibrant part of environmental justice in the Sacramento region. The coalition on regional equity, and then the environmental justice group that spun off from that, this is that same house that Katie was showing, developed a strategy around vacant spaces and wasted places, and so looking at empty spaces that unfortunately are not empty, but places often of dumping trash and illicit activity, can be a real drain on community vitality, community sense of pride. These are maps created by a colleague of mine at UC Davis, Mary Cadnasso, where she showed where all the various vacant lots are, and this was in Del Paso Heights, and this in South Sacramento Broadway here in Stockton Boulevard. You can see in a number of blocks there's a lot of vacant lots, and you can imagine what that does to neighborhood vitality. These are a few years old now, and already a lot of these lots are being developed, leading to new issues of concerns about gentrification. A really important part of the environmental justice story in Sacramento is and Katie in Q&A can talk a lot more about this in more detail than I can, but there was a proposal to inject massive, billions of cubic meters of compressed natural gas underneath a predominantly low-income and community of color in the Glen Elder neighborhood, the Avon Glen Elder neighborhood. And I probably don't have time to go into all the details, but there was a lot of very questionable building or business practices where the company did a lot to manipulate people into accepting the facility, but the community also rallied itself. This is Constance Slider-Peer, who at the time was the chair of the neighborhood association. A number of activists. Colin Bailey was a legal aid attorney working on it, and Katie, you probably know a lot of these other people much better than I do. And used also action research and advocacy at the policy level, and were able to have the facility rejected by the Utility Commission. And we call that Sometimes David Wins. There's this really great book about the American farm workers by a guy named Marshall Gans, and it's sort of the David and Goliath model, and he asks, like, why do some social movements win, and what are the characteristics? So this had a lot of those, a diverse coalition connecting sort of elite and grassroots, bringing in knowledge partners, being able to target key allies at the policy level, sticking to it, a number of these qualities that can be emulated in other movements. So these are kind of some of like the key issue areas, and I'll show you a little bit now about some of the more specific data. So this is, again, back to the CalEnviro screen. In red are the areas that are in the top 25% of communities throughout the state that have the most pronounced extreme levels of both environmental hazards and social vulnerability. And you can see areas in South Sacramento, massive areas of the Delta, up along the Sacramento River, up in the kind of Yuba, Marysville area, and North Sacramento, Del Paso Heights. So you could see that image a little bit here. Again, the CalEnviro screen, from the green at the lowest level of cumulative environmental and social hazard up to the red at the highest. This block in West Sacramento it's actually in the top 5% in the entire state, and you can sort of understand that in terms of air quality with sort of major highways here, rail line, old industrial facilities, contaminated drinking water, and others. But you can also see that they're not alone. Massive areas of the Delta and so on. So then we looked at, tried to break out some of the specific issues like air quality. This is particulate matter that's generated from heavy, sort of an incomplete combustion. So diesel and other kinds of industrial plants, as well as auto, like brake dust, and in some cases plowing and other kinds of agricultural practices. So you can kind of see this whole southern part of the region most highly affected, and this is sort of the area around Elk Grove that has the absolute highest in the region. Although relative to the rest of the state, it's much better. The air quality here generally is much better, although relatively speaking, the southern extent is most challenged. Kind of a very different pattern here, looking at hazardous waste and toxic waste cleanup sites. You see the rail yards is here has the highest concentration for probably obvious reasons, but you also see some areas here in the south side of the 50 and Rancho Cordova, up along the 80, some up here in Yuba County. So this kind of, as I say, kind of patchwork. Drinking water contamination, you could see a significant issue as a result of agricultural practices affecting nitrate levels in the water, also things like hexavalent chromium or chromium 6. That's very often a industrial contaminant, and a lot of others. In the urban areas, it's generally better because it's municipal water supplies, and in the rural areas, it's much worse. And if you look, as we're doing now, a new project in the San Joaquin Valley, often it's unincorporated communities, particularly low-income or disadvantaged unincorporated communities, DUCs, that has really extreme drinking water problems, both in terms of quality, quantity, like is there water at all, and then the cost. So those issues are particularly pronounced in the San Joaquin Valley, but as you can see, we have some significant issues here as well. Pesticide use, right? Not surprisingly, the kind of agricultural belt on the west and north parts of the region have significant applications of agricultural pesticides. Also down here in the delta, and those have effects both on workers in the fields, the communities that live in and around those fields that are drifted upon by pesticide applicators. But then also you need to think about what you're eating and the kinds of impacts on consumers. We did a lot of work, as we show, on the regional scale, but it's also really useful to look at this at the neighborhood scale. So we took a kind of a more detailed analysis of 4 different neighborhoods up in here in Del Paso Heights, East Sacramento, what's sometimes called the Depot Park, Depot Park or Vineyards out here, and then the avenues as the sort of southern part of South Sacramento, and looked at a number of different kinds of characteristics, and you could see, some significant differences, say with the avenues that relative to the state, the people who, this is linguistic isolation, which means those that don't have someone in the household over the age of 18 who speaks English well. That's from the census. So highest level in the whole state, all the way down to 35% in East Sacramento, and you can see how the others stack up. So then we showed that in terms of data for environmental contaminants, cleanup sites, particulate matter, and drinking water, and on a lot of issues, what we think of often as environmental justice communities, Del Paso Heights and South Sacramento, these 2 middle bars, had the worst environmental conditions, although, for example, in East Sacramento, particulate matter was not as high as these 2, but it was higher, that is worse than Del Paso Heights, and some of that is because of the ways that wind moves, because of the highway lineup. So one of the things we found is that everyone has a stake in environmental justice. It's not only in quote-unquote those neighborhoods. There are things that are affecting all populations. I mean, think about drinking water and sort of the toxic plumes, say, those really are affecting people regardless of income. So we have a shared fate. There's also issues of climate change and climate justice. So climate change, of course, is global, but it also affects different people in different ways. So these are satellite images, just sort of a regular satellite image, and this is sort of a heat image. And without going into too much details, this satellite imagery can actually pick up ground level temperatures, and in communities that don't have a mature or significant urban forests that have higher impervious surfaces, like pavement, darker land uses that would have larger, darker surfaces, the temperature can be significantly higher, affecting health, affecting people's ability and interest to go outside and walk and bike and recreate in the summertime. So really having a number of different kinds of health effects. Fortunately, there's a lot of really terrific activism by Sacramento Tree Foundation, people working on climate justice activities. This is actually sort of about fracking and sending fracked oil through local railroads, rail lines, but really part of this larger climate justice movement. So how to support those kinds of activities to build them up even further. So we laid out a wide variety of actions, and Katie's going to talk more. I'm going to turn this back over to her. But some of the things that we drew out from the research and also from the community partners themselves, suggesting that regional planning, whether that's a variety of different types, would do well to bring environmental justice as a core principle and a process. So like the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, RHNA, or the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, or things about drinking water, like the integrated regional water management, and other kinds of efforts need to take in environmental justice. Recommending that agencies use, this is CS Calendar screen, use not only statewide analyses but also regionally specific analyses that could otherwise wash out if you're, say, comparing Sacramento to Los Angeles. We need to understand about what's happening in our own region. Greenhouse gas reduction fund funds should continue to go, and Katie's done a lot of work with this, and other funds in addition to GGRF going to these most disadvantaged communities on a variety of different issues as laid out there, and that the decision-making and public participation process also needs to be really working with these communities, and in many cases driven by these communities, not just involving them. For the philanthropic sector, first of all, there just needs to be more money coming to the organizations. Movement here is much less well-funded than other regions of the state. There's a variety of different historical reasons behind that. We've suggested creating a Sacramento Region Environmental Justice Fund, similar to one that Sierra Health Foundation has created for the San Joaquin Valley, the San Joaquin Valley Health Fund. That could bring in a wide range of funders and create more sustained and coordinated funding for EJ groups here. Help bridge to national funders, do capacity building for local organizations so that they can take in and manage and sustain this kind of work. Thinking about some really innovative work that's happening about green jobs and making sure that the communities that are most disadvantaged are getting access to those jobs. From the community organizations, consider a campaign that wide variety of groups could come together around. Consider a regional coalition, and as Katie said, there's a lot of work, and she's spearheading a lot of that happening at the neighborhood scale, which is crucial. And then to complement that, to consider something like Coalition on Regional Equity. Bring in this wide variety of partners, connect the urban core to the rural periphery and all the different organizations there, and to sustain this, really think about organizational development, leadership, and so on. Some other kinds of activities, again, broadening out the coalition. There's a a really wonderful crowdsourcing platform called Ivan, identifying violations affecting neighborhoods, where community members can report and aggregate onto a website different kinds of suspected environmental violations that's happening in other parts of the state. There's interest to do it here. And then use this report to really help tell compelling stories using data and community knowledge. And just sort of one last thing on that, I'll just give you an example. Your CivicSpark, of course, so a little bit on civic science. This was a project that we did in the San Joaquin Valley, but could be used in Sacramento or the other places that the CivicSpark fellows are, where we worked with regional advocates like Debbie Reyes. She's the director of the Prison Moratorium Project for San Joaquin Valley, and then worked with neighborhood activists in West Fresno. This is Mary Curry. She'll show up later in my slides, so keep your eye on her. And they were indicating places on the maps that government databases didn't cover, but the neighborhood people knew about what was going on there. And then we took those data on the maps and put it into a GIS form. And the red dots here are all the places that community members identified. The green dots, and there are not as many of those, were the ones that government agencies identified. So then they use these maps, there she is, Mary Curry. They use these maps to advocate for their communities to say, look, when we say there's environmental justice issues, first off, this is a high percentage communities of color, between 91 and 100%. And that's where this concentration of environmental hazards are. Even if you are not recognizing that government agency, we are showing you that these are really significant concerns, and we are asking you, telling you that we need protection and action. And they have done a much more successful, not just because of our maps, but because they've integrated those into their action. And this guy here in the, let's see here, in the side, his name's Mr. Mitchell, Gregory Mitchell, and we were at a workshop a couple of years after this was taken, and he said, he's like this very dignified guy. I can't do his voice well enough, super low voice. He's like, these maps, we had been talking to the powers that be, but your maps gave us the power to be. And everyone in the room just went, oh my God, that is deep. And it was like very, very powerful. And it's not that I didn't take it as we were literally giving him the power to be, but being able to tell their story and the ways in which they were not being really seen and heard by the powers that be, were able to really stand up for themselves and tell their story in a powerful way. Okay, I'm going to turn to the next slide, which is Katie's, and I think turn to, actually, let's see. Before I do that, I want to do one thing, which is just show you on our website, and then get back to Katie. So if you go to the Center for Regional Change website, there are these three panels. In the middle, can you see my screen, the website?
We see it's currently your GoToWebinar screen.
Oh, that's not good. Let's see. How about, does that work? Maybe this is not going to work. What do you see now? Okay. Okay. So maybe I'll do this. Does that work? No. Okay. Anyway, if you go to our website and you go to Environmental Justice tab, you'll see a wide variety of our environmental justice reports, including this one that I've been talking about, one on Ivan, the crowdsourcing one, and a couple of our other ones. So if you want to check out more, that is the place to do it. All right, back to you, Katie, in the newsroom.
Great.
Thanks, Jonathan. So while we get that back to the slides over here, I just want to say that the folks in West Fresno are actually still working with the data Jonathan gave them, and at the end of last year presented the Southwest Fresno specific plan, where they actually put into place, working with the city, proactive land use policies to move out industrial uses from their neighborhood and start bringing in and incentivizing positive land uses into their area. So this takes a long time, but they have still carried the torch that Jonathan helped them light way back then. So it's exciting to see that work continue, and I think they've set a good model for the rest of us around the state. Okay, we're clicking. Oh, yes, that's 30. There you go. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so, can you see my? Okay. So to sort of wrap it out, like, we wanted to leave you all with some key tips for doing work that addresses environmental justice. I didn't put this into these slides, and I should have, that, you know, when you look at the map for where communities of color have historically been allowed to form in Sacramento, you still see life expectancy trends trend directly with those maps. Like, the communities that were built for more affluent white communities still have higher life expectancies to this day than the communities that were built for people of color. So the legacy that has been built from this racialized notion of land use is still persists. Like Jonathan said, communities have very long memories. So to do the work well, it requires a certain level of flexibility. The first major point of flexibility is going where the communities are, and this seems incredibly commonsensical, but I mean, I've had to argue with local jurisdictions as recently as just a couple months ago to say you can't do a climate action plan without going to the neighborhood that lights up red on this map. You can't do a transit plan without going to the neighborhood that has no transit to get to your meeting to tell you what they need for transit. Like, it seems very commonsensical, but it's still a fight that environmental justice communities and us here in Sacramento fight all of the time. You know, something as simple as our regional transit meetings that are at a location where transit stops before the meeting ends. So how is someone who's dependent on transit supposed to go to this meeting to have their voice heard about transit decisions that impact their ability to get around? These are very basic things, but they're important and really critical, and if you implement them, you will be at the cutting edge of your field, I promise. The second big point is to really allow for meaningful feedback, and this is hard when agencies are used to going into communities late in the game, usually after a work plan and a timeline has been developed, after some pre-designed notion of what we're asking for input on has been formed, and there is no space in that conversation for neighborhoods to really give you that deep feedback that might direct the project in a totally different way. So to the degree that it's possible, it does take time and it does take money, and that's where the clincher usually is. But what's possible, as you saw with some of these communities that Jonathan's been working with, that you saw with Avondale Glen Elder and their fight against the Sacramento Natural Gas Storage Project and their continued work around these really innovative solutions, the communities can come up with some stuff that's really powerful if they're given the space to learn and discuss what solutions they want for their communities. Keeping people informed is a really difficult one, but there are systems in place, as even if it's as simple as making sure that one mom at the elementary school knows about something with enough time to send it out through the folks that she talks to and from school every day, as what we've done in the avenues, which is, you know, we tried all of these different things before finally saying, wait, if we tell these 3 or 4 moms, they're getting the word out to everybody, and we just need to really make sure that we tell those 3 or 4 moms before, because the email blast and the text message blast and all of that just won't get to them the same way the natural discussions work. So there are methods of getting the word out, as informal as they might be. So working with communities to identify what those are and to keep them in use is really important, as well as providing that continued opportunity to stay engaged. I can't tell you the number of neighborhoods I've been to where somebody came out and did a charrette or did an outreach meeting and then never came back again. And that community, the communities have long memories, both in the physical sense as well as in the psychological sense. It degrades our ability to come back and continue to engage when all they know is that people come out and engage and then they never come back. So how can we keep those folks informed and keep them in the loop as we move towards implementation of our really important work that we hope they'll do? And I think particularly when you look at climate justice work. This is going to require, even at the state level, when you read the scoping plan, if you have many hours and nothing better to do, which I'm sure none of you will ever find yourself reading that in its entirety, you'll notice that throughout that document, it talks about local action, how important it is. Like, we can make the most efficient cars, we can make the most efficient energy sources, but if people don't actually use these things and integrate them into their lives, it won't make the difference that we think it's going to make to achieving our goals as a state. So we must find ways for people to continue to stay informed and to take ownership over our solutions. And I think what you're going to learn, as what Jonathan said, is that, like, not only does this take time and money, but that this is kind of our job. I mean, when you're working for these civic organizations, it's your responsibility to go and seek input from these folks. This isn't an obligation that you have, it's a duty. And it's something that is for far too long, it's been okay to hold a meeting, say in downtown Sacramento at 1 p.m. and to have only white, more affluent people come to your meeting and to call that outreach, and not expected that you would actually go out and actively solicit input. Silence, one of the big principles in environmental justice movements is that silence does not equal consent. That just because you don't hear from people in these communities does not mean that they don't care, does not mean that they do not have opinion, and you should not take their lack of comment as an indication that they are okay with what you're doing. It requires a very proactive solicitation of that input and partnership. And that is ongoing relationship. I think the biggest favor you all can do in your placements is to really help the people you're working with develop that relationship. Who do you call? What type of things do they like in their meetings? What type of food should you bring if you're hosting a workshop? Like develop that repertoire. Like, before I came here, I was actually having lunch with one of the people in that photo from Avondale and Elders. Like, you get to a point where you're comfortable enough with them, or when I bring out an idea, they see that as an opportunity and they don't question my motives because they know me. This robust engagement gives you the data and the buy-in that you need for successful projects. I can't, even the Air Resources Board, as little as like a week ago, they weren't going to include drip irrigation in the scoping plan for 2030 because, in their words, most farmers were using drip irrigation already. And I kind of went, like, well, I live in this, my family's in the Central Valley. I was down there just a few weeks ago, and I'm pretty sure I'm still seeing a lot of people doing overhead sprayers, sometimes even at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and they had no idea that that's what was happening. And so they lost an opportunity, potentially, if they hadn't asked us that question, they would have lost an opportunity for increased reductions just by me telling them as a community member, like, no, I'm sorry, they're not doing drip irrigation in a lot of these valley communities, and there's still a lot of work to be done there. They would have never known if they hadn't asked us. So that data is, it seems, it's really critical to be aware when someone like in West Fresno says, hey, I know your data says this, but you're missing this really important thing. In Sacramento, we have air monitors on T Street, and then our next monitor is in Elk Grove. So between T Street and Elk Grove, when you have high asthma death rates, there's a community right in the middle of that called Valley High that has some of the highest respiratory illness death rates of any other zip code in the county of Sacramento. It kind of makes you wonder, like, maybe we're still missing something when it comes to data. If you have a lot of people dying of respiratory illness, we might be missing something there. What does the community say is happening down there that we might be able to address that the data just can't tell us because it's not everywhere? My next to last point is the most obvious one, is just that you need well-informed constituents make better political decisions. If you have people from council districts across the city saying, yeah, we believe in this, yes, we want this, it's going to happen. It's not enough to be right in politics, and that's some free advice that I can give you right now. But most politicians don't really care if you're right. They care about how it looks, and they care about what their constituents think. So if you're doing the right outreach and you're able to demonstrate to them that people who live in their district want this thing that you're pushing, it is much more likely that it'll get done. Not because the data says that's the best way to get done, but because people in West Fresno come out in droves and say, this is what we want done. And finally, in the end, and this is just the real kicker for me, I mean, there's all of this other stuff, but in the end, this robust community partnerships creates more creative projects, more effective projects, more collaborative projects that have the type of differences that we want to see in these neighborhoods. So it does take time and it does take money, but in the end, you end up with things that you didn't probably even think was possible when you started the process, because communities are just endlessly creative and ready to do the work. So our final sort of call to action for you is to really respect the multiple forms of knowledge. Just because an air monitor or a data point that you have doesn't say something's a problem, in some cases you might be missing something. So it's important to respect community knowledge as valid and important to your process. But it's really great when you collaborate with agencies, so it's easier for communities to collaborate with you. Don't hold a meeting about transportation when in a month somebody's going to come hold a meeting about housing, and in another month somebody's going to come and hold a meeting about bus passes, and in another month someone's going to come and hold a meeting about school practices. Try to hold one big meeting. It's all related when you live in these neighborhoods, so why not work together and make it easier for people to come to you with their ideas. Taking time to educate the community and solicit enough time to actually incorporate their responses is really important. This is a fight we're having right now with ARB, is they've literally designed a scoping plan process that they're going to be writing the final plan as we're still doing community workshops in environmental justice communities across the state. So how are they going to incorporate that feedback into their plan? They literally can't. And that's a point that, again, we're still fighting in 2017, and I wish that we didn't have to fight. But it's something that does you well to think through, when do you start your environmental analysis for your project matters? You know, when you start releasing public documents matters, because it gives the public the perception of whether or not their input matters. Looking at outcomes. So Bill Kennedy, a friend of both Jonathan and mine, once told me something so simple and yet so profound, it was beautiful. He said, I don't care if something doesn't appear to be disparate in its face. You could not mention race anywhere in a policy, but if the outcomes of your decision result in disparate outcomes across different racial groups, if it impacts people of color in a negative way more than it does other people, it is not a racially just policy. So it does not matter if you're not calling out Black people, if your policy disproportionately harms Black people because of like they just happen to live in the neighborhood next to the Aerojet facility, or they just happen to live next to a freeway. That is not a racially just process, and that requires the type of analysis and upfront. You have to look down the line towards your project. What are the outcomes of this project going to be, and will it impact communities of color more than another, and how can I avoid that negative impact? And in the best case, actually create a more positive impact for those neighborhoods than would have otherwise been seen. And finally, just to step back every once in a while, you know, when they say sometimes you miss the forest through the trees, it's really easy to get into these complex processes and programs and not step back and think about whether or not this resource is being used most effectively. Should we be spending a ton of time paying people to go out and talk to people about changing out light bulbs? Is there something else that we could be doing that would have a better long-term impact and actually rapidly increase the amount of buy-in that we're getting to our policies in the communities? That's sometimes what's really important, and sometimes you don't step back and you think, oh, that agency's got $10,000 to do this, and we have $10,000 to do this. If we work together, we could probably do a really cool project in these neighborhoods. It's just takes that little bit of intentionality and that occasional checking in with yourself and your work to make sure you're having the best impact. So, that's that. So that's it for now. We'd love to hear your questions, and I think we have a good little amount of time for Q&A from folks. Yeah, we do.
I'm going to put this up so we've got a bit of a visual. So, well, first of all, thank you so much, Katie and Jonathan, for that overview. We've got a lot of questions, but definitely encourage folks to send them along so that I can try to group them together as best as possible. So, starting off, we got a couple of questions about some of the tools that Jonathan was mentioning before. One of them comes from one of our fellows who's working up in the Tahoe region, and she asked, so when you're talking about Cal EnviroScreen, how does the tool account for the different situations in rural communities? You know, you've got affordable housing issues, lack of transportation. How, if at all, are those factors being incorporated into Cal EnviroScreen?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and there's actually been a lot of concern from rural forest communities as well as coastal, like northwest coast communities, that the tool shows inaccurately or doesn't accurately show the extent of environmental injustices there, and some of that is because and this is a bit different in the newest version, and to tell you the truth, I haven't looked at it enough to see how much they've fixed, but there was a lot of statistical weighting on air quality. They had like a lot of different air quality measures, so it accounted for a lot of the score. And fortunately, in rural communities in the hills and mountains, the air quality is pretty good. So that's good. The bad part is it showed that these weren't environmental justice communities, just an artifice of the tool itself. So that's been a significant problem that groups have highlighted. There's also the issues in a lot of different places, including in Native American communities and tribal lands, and just other Native American communities, that the data are not as good. There's sort of issues of what kinds of data are collected, and how they're collected and how they're shared. So there's also some big missing pieces there, which kind of has two different implications. That one is you should continue to try to make the tool better and better, and the State Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment has done a really good job. I mean, it is 3.0. There was like 1.1, 1.2, 2, and 3. So they've been working really hard to continue to make it better, and they will continue to do so. And equally important, and at the same time, it's really important to do ground truthing to make sure, A, that the data in the tool are good, and it's only as good as the data that goes in, but also that there's tons of information that just are never going to show up in government databases, and that's why that civic science process is so important. So really getting out there, talking with people, listening to their lived life experiences, that's a crucial part of environmental justice that just better indices, better maps, will never be able to meet.
Well, and just to add in real quickly too, because I've had a lot of conversations with Department of Public Health about these maps, and I think part of the tension is that EnviroScreen is not intended to be a public health map. It's intended to identify environmental justice communities that are close to mobile and stationary sources of pollution. It's not intended to recognize where there's low-income populations. It's not intended to recognize where there's other diseases because of other factors. And so that's part of the tension, is I think since so much money's been put behind EnviroScreen, folks are concerned about Lake County, and they're concerned about these other areas that have really poor health outcomes but are not on the map. And that's simply because the intention of this is to identify communities that are close to pollution sources, not just communities that have environment or have poor health outcomes. There's other maps that do that much better than EnviroScreen ever will.
Could you, Kristen, I don't know if you could do this easily, but to share my screen quickly, because there's on exactly that note, as Katie said, other tools. So one that we've, let's see here. One that we've created is called the Regional Opportunity Index. Can people see that now on the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So, so you could go on our website and see it there. So we have a wide variety of different kinds of data sets. As you can see, education, economy, health, housing, transportation, civic life, demographics, and then a whole bunch of other categories, and you can map specific areas, and you could we have something called the Opportunity Index for people, so that's like the attributes of individuals. So for example, if you're interested in Del Paso Heights and North Sacramento, if you clicked on a census tract, the red are areas that are much lower opportunity across all of these different dimensions. And you could see, compared to the state mean, which is here, all of these different elements are far below in terms of what kinds of opportunities are afforded. And then if you look at, say, like Midtown or like East Sacramento, you can see just right nearby, the kinds of opportunities that are provided are very different. And our intention in creating this was as an investment guide for banks and for housing developers and other agencies making sorts of investment decisions that could focus on not just the environmental disparities, as Katie mentioned, but a wide range of equity disparities that other sorts of strategies are needed to address. And if people are interested, I know last year the CivicSpark, a number of the fellows used this tool for a variety of their projects. So if anyone wanted a little bit more of background on it, we'd be happy to have some of our staff give you a briefing on how to use it.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. And another tool-related question goes to Ivan. This is a kind of high-level question for folks who aren't as familiar with the tool. What happens when something's reported through Ivan? Is there any sort of follow-up, or how are those actions actually worked on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if you're still looking at my screen or not. You don't necessarily need to, but so this is it. Just sorry, that is the way that the visual is working, but it's Ivan Online, and there's all these different locations, including more recently here in more recently in the urban areas in Bay Area and Southern California. So what happens is when you make a report, or which you can call in or type in or send a video, send a photo or whatever. It then loads up to a that didn't work. It loads up to a website. I won't try to mess with it right now. It goes up to a website, aggregates it, looks like a Google map with lots of different points on it, and then the reports. If there was a video, there's a video or photo or whatever. So that's like the cool techie side. The really powerful part is actually the social technology, which is that each month in each of these places there's an Ivan task force of community activists and agencies, and they look at the reports that have come in that last month, and they kind of triage them to the different agencies that are responsible for those issues for investigation and potential enforcement. And then the next month they come back and they check in and see, how well has an issue been resolved, and then they have to post that resolution, if there has been one, up online, and so the community groups can really have a level of transparency and hold the agencies accountable in this very public way. We do have on our EJ list of reports, we do have a report on Ivan that goes into a lot more detail.
Thank you. So switching gears a little bit, we got a few questions about something that Katie mentioned about the importance of having partners in local governments that are really allies for the work. So what do you suggest to fellows who maybe don't have those allies in their local governments and want to get this work done? What are some of the ways that they can maybe convince some more hesitant policymakers?
That's a great question. Being from Kern County, I know a little bit about what that's like, and I think that's when you go to the communities. The communities, I mean, even in your most conservative parts of the state, when you talk to communities about, children being able to have an opportunity to learn, regardless of what neighborhood they're born into, or, having access to food, it's not their fault that they don't have food, right? And you get people buy-in into these ideas, and that's sometimes what's necessary to get the buy-in of the agencies. I wish that it was always the case, like you go to the local governments and it's the right thing to do, and they say, yeah, great, we're totally going to jump on board and do that. But sometimes you have to get the neighborhoods and communities mobilized a little bit first and get them to ask for it, and then you get local government partners to come to the table. We're actually doing that in Sacramento right now. There's a new bill that passed, SB 1000, that requires environmental justice elements to be incorporated into general plans for the first time ever. And so naturally in Sacramento, I thought, hey, the Sac City and County general plans are due at the same time. We should do a process together. Doesn't that make so much sense? Of course it makes sense, but of course nobody's saying yes. So part of what I'm doing now is mobilizing organizers to start the visioning and planning processes in the different disadvantaged neighborhoods here, so that when they do start their general plan update, we at least have our thing ready to go, and then it pushes them to do that, to incorporate those more progressive policies into their plan, and hopefully demonstrate to them that if they had bought into this process earlier, they would have had this awesome partnership with the neighborhoods, because they're totally capable of doing this. But sometimes you have to be strategic with your inside and outside strategy, and really work with your community community partners who sometimes don't even know that there's an opportunity to ask their local government official for something. But if you say, man, did you know in San Diego they had this amateurization thing that they implemented that moved out negative land uses in a pretty rapid fashion and replaced them with more positive ones? Wouldn't that be cool here? And then next thing you know, you've got neighborhoods banging down the door of local government saying, hey, we want what they did in San Diego. Why can't we do that here? So that's inside-outside strategy is sometimes the best way to address those hesitant folks.
Great. And for folks who are in the room as well, just shoot up your hand if you have a question as well. So another kind of a follow-up question to that, one of our fellows asked about engaging communities in particular, and that's so much of what people think of engaging and doing outreach and connecting with folks over the internet. And how do you engage communities that don't have access to the internet and just can't communicate in that way?
Definitely. First, you have to identify those leaders in that community. And like I said, it could be starting at schools. You know, it's figuring out who those parents are that everybody knows about, who does outreach. You know, where are the kids going to after school programs? You know, where are parents going to get groceries? Where do they go on the holidays? You know, where are those spots that you know you can reach folks? And then being willing to be pretty creative. There's food distributions that happen all over the city in Sacramento, and the county was having trouble outreaching to low-income folks who didn't speak English, but I heard the food bank talk about how they have to have 5 different language translators at their mobile food distributions because they'll get folks who speak Russian and Vietnamese and Hmong, and they can't communicate with them, and their lines around the block, and they're waiting forever, and it's this really untenable situation. And I thought, wouldn't it make sense if the county partnered with the food bank, and while people were standing in line for an hour waiting for their food, ask them some questions about things that they'd like in their neighborhood. So sometimes it's about finding those creative allies. Somebody, like, people don't live in a bubble. I think as much as we like to pretend that everybody just drives in and out of their garage and never interacts with everybody, there's always a point of contact somewhere. So working creatively with those partners, and then when you do have those events, if you can pull together a meeting, sometimes it's not possible to pull together a separate meeting, and that's just the nature of these neighborhoods. In some cases, you have to rely on canvassing or more creative survey techniques to get that data. But if you can do a meeting, it's about food, it's about childcare, having music, having co-hosts that are from the neighborhood that people are familiar with, so they're excited to go and come, having prizes that you can give away, ideally reimbursing them for their time because we respect their time, and when you respect something, you're willing to pay for it as part of your budget. Those are all different like tips and tricks, but in the end, it requires that flexible partnerships with the folks who already in those neighborhoods for one reason or another, and really in every neighborhood is different, but there's those similar trends that you can hopefully draw down on.
Thank you. So this next question is for both of you. So one of our fellows who's not in the Sacramento region was wondering how, and if you're finding that this work in Sacramento is indicative of the larger statewide issues, and in particular, if you can talk about some of the specific approaches to engagement that have been really applicable and effective in Sacramento that you think could be effective elsewhere.
Yes, I haven't found that much different from what we're doing in Sacramento. The good thing about being on the statewide AB 32 committee is that we've traveled our meetings around the state as we've been doing our work, and you know, from North State tribal lands to the border region, we're finding very similar efforts, very similar methods, and very similar concerns being expressed about statewide climate policies. So I think as much as there's individual contextual things that are important to think about, there's also some things that run pretty continuous across the communities, and one of them is that form of engagement. So in every single case, we've worked with local partners, and so in Sacramento, it's either been like that neighborhood association or that council member or like that food bank partner that's in that neighborhood, that it's to let them tell me what type of engagement works for their community, if it's just an informal dot survey that I do while they're standing in line, or if it's an actual meeting and when I need to hold that meeting and where and at what time of day, so that I'll get the maximum participation, and then following that lead and really letting the local partner tell me what makes most sense. And even here in Sacramento, it's like what works in Meadowview is different than what works in El Paso Heights, and is totally different than what works in Oak Park. So you have to be willing to follow the lead of that local group who will tell you, okay, this is what we do, this is how it worked, and yeah, I think in the end, across the state, when we held these workshops, we let each local group tell us when and where and how and what type of food and what type of childcare and what type of language translation, even the workshop flow. Do you want to do a World Cafe where you're doing roundtables? Do you want to keep it just open and everybody speak at the mic? And we had over 700 comments received from community members in just in less than 10 workshops that we did just in that first month. So it does work. It just takes a little bit of willingness to be creative. You know, like last weekend, I was literally taping down black sheeting to make a little road because we were dealing with a multilingual population, and so we made this road that moved around through these different installations, and we had dot stickers at the end of each one for people to tell us, like, yeah, I like that bike lane, or hey, I like that play structure, because that was what worked, and it worked. And we had like 200 people go through, but you know, or sometimes it requires thinking outside of the box and letting your creativity tell you what makes most sense.
Love the creativity there.
Yeah.
Jonathan, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I think Katie said it well.
Great. So another follow-up question to that is for fellows who don't yet know who the leaders are in their community and don't know who to reach out to. I think a lot of fellows are from outside the region or from outside the state. What are some suggestions that you have for folks to help identify who those community leaders are and how to best to communicate with them?
Definitely start the local electeds know who they are for the most part. So like if somebody called my council member and said, who do I call to do outreach there? Like he's going to give you my phone number. So I think in a lot of cases, these folks have canvassed their neighborhoods, they've talked to it, they've gone to the churches, they've done the door knocking. So they're going to be able to say, yeah, Jesse in Meadowview, he's the one you have to call. Or like, you know, David in Del Paso Heights, he's the one you're going to have to call and he'll help you point you in the right direction. There's this woman, Mary in Del Paso Heights, who doesn't run any neighborhood association, isn't involved in any formal group, but she was like the one. Like you call Mary Watts, she's going to tell you who to call, and you're going to figure it. Like she'll get you in touch with the right people. So if at first you don't know where to start with your council offices, and then just keep going down the rabbit hole. And eventually you'll find that one or two people that everybody knows who all the players are and who can help point you in the right direction.
I would add to that that there are a number of environmental justice networks that could be tapped into. They're not sort of full coverage of the state, depending on where you are, but certainly throughout the San Joaquin Valley, there's and the Central Coast, there's the Central California Environmental Justice Network. There's a sort of a more grassrootsy one. I think it's like the California Environmental Justice Network. Katie, is that right? That Green Action coordinates?
Yeah, CEJA is coordinated. Environmental Health Coalition in San Diego is one of the anchors down there. CEJA is based across the state. Yeah, right. You know, Comité de Cívico in Imperial. CCAEJ, so of course I can't remember what all these acronyms stand for in San Bernardino, but yeah, there's a good, in each of the major regions, I said probably maybe like North State, and in that case I'd go to like the tribal groups up there, has like a pretty solid like EJ organization. That's a good point, Jonathan.
So, and it may be so that you could kind of look throughout there, and I imagine between Katie and I, depending on where you are, we could either like tell you who to talk to or tell you who to talk to tell you who to talk to. So you could be in contact with us, and we could make those connections.
Yeah, so if you are interested in that, just reach out to me and I can connect you with Katie and Jonathan. So next question, kind of an interesting one. What are some ways you've seen well-meaning people hurt the cause of environmental justice or equity in their region, and how can fellows, staff members avoid these missteps?
Question. Jonathan, do you want to go first?
It's a great question. Unfortunately, there's probably a lot to say about it. So one thing that's been really problematic is when there have been health studies or other sorts of environmental justice studies that haven't involved community members up front in the methodology, and they've sort of just like been dropped on the community's lap, or even worse, done done about the community and not shared with them at all, and then brought to some public agency that makes a decision about whether to permit a plant or not, or whether there's a health issue that needs to be addressed or not. That can literally put communities at risk, and certainly create significant bad will and kind of a re-victimizing. So that would be one. I think there's a lot of public participation approaches, and Katie was talking about all the things you need to think about. So in cases where that's not done, where there's not translation at all, or appropriate or interpreting, where there's things that come across as really culturally insensitive, that can really be counterproductive. There's, Katie, again, all the things you're saying, just classic examples, and I'm so sad but not surprised that this is happening again by car. But this issue of timing, of kind of giving community members and organizations a chance to review something, but not nearly enough time, or in some cases not enough resources to be able to have have the experts that they need, or just give the experts that they have the time needed to go through it. That's sort of setting the thing up for failure, or worse, setting it up for conflict. So sadly, these are just like the same lessons that a number of us have pointed out for years and years, but somehow people just keep falling into that same track.
Yeah, and I think like some of the other examples that are popping into my head are like business interest, where like the idea is, but people in these neighborhoods need jobs, and this is a company that's going to provide jobs, and we should let them come in, even if it means a 16-pump gas station right off of your freeway off-ramp, or we should let them come in even if it's a diesel truck distribution center in a neighborhood that's already sandwiched between a freeway and a power generation plant, because it's better than nothing. And I think like that idea of like it's better than nothing, and the advocacy that comes behind that from sometimes the labor community, sometimes just the business community in general, has been really toxic, because a lot of what the environmental justice movement, our biggest struggle within the movement, is really teaching communities that they deserve more, that you deserve more, that somebody just saying that you're going to get this union job and that should be good enough for you doesn't mean that you have to say yes to additional pollution in your neighborhood, or that you have to say yes to this immediate opportunity because they're not sure what the next opportunity will be if you push for something different. So that to me has been the hardest, and in some cases it's clearly profit driven, but in other cases it's genuinely been pastors or different groups who are organizing because they're working with low-income people and they want them to have good jobs. And I totally sympathize with where they're coming from, but we deserve more than additional pollution in our neighborhoods, and that's a hard, that comes up all the time. I can't name, there's so many examples I can't even get into just one, so unfortunately.
Well, I would love to keep having this discussion forever, but we're pretty much out of time. If I could ask you both one last question. There was a great call to action at the end of the presentation, but if you could kind of empower the fellows to take one action in the next week to get going on this work if they aren't already, what closing message would you leave with them?
I would say, and it's kind of a gutsy one, but it'd be cool to, like, whatever your service area is, to look at any data tool that makes sense for you and to identify one of the communities in that area that would be considered an EJ community or an under-resourced community, and to try to have a one-on-one with one person who lives there. Not somebody who serves there, not somebody who represents there, but like find a resident from that area and just sit down and say, hey, I'm new to this work, I'm interested in what you think, and just listen to them and learn a little bit. I'm sure they'll tell you a lot about their experience, even looking at the high-speed rail authority person in the room, like I'm sure you'll hear a lot of stuff about it, but it's important to understand why these communities are concerned, what they have to be concerned about, to help inform your perspective as you move into your service for these next few months.
Thanks, Katie. Jonathan?
Yeah, that's a really good one. Yeah, I guess I would take the first half of that and just expand on it in terms of using one of these data tools, which is to go in addition to like the quantitative data tools, to get some good historical resources about your place, especially if you're not from there, and start reading, find out like where did this place come from? How did people first come there? What if, who owns the land? Who's in control of the political parties and local governments? What's the power structure there? Becoming, if not, you don't have a lot of time, but there's this phrase of becoming native to place, like kind of, or at least connecting into the nativeness of place, because so much of the environmental justice is about like that texture, that nuance, that culture of place, and getting a greater feel for that, I think is gonna really help in all of those next levels of relationship building.
Great. A lot to do and a lot to look into in the next couple of days. But thank you both so much. Thank you, Jonathan and Katie, for taking the time today, and thanks to all the fellows for your great questions throughout this webinar. A couple of folks asked if the slides were going to be available, and I can share a PDF as well as a video recording out to you all probably tomorrow. But thank you again. Really appreciate it. And I hope everyone else has a great rest of their week.
Thank you. That was great. Yeah, bye. Take care. Okay, bye.